So what, what I want to talk to you about today is cultural group selection. In particular, I want to give you a précis of a paper that my former students and I wrote, came out a couple of years ago now, on the empirical side of cultural group selection. So our starting point was that a lot of people have critiqued or even ignored cultural group selection on the grounds that there's just some theoretical models and no evidence. And it seemed to us that the amount of evidence in favor of cultural group selection is very large, and it's something you have to take seriously. And so there turns out to be a prejudice against group selection that derives from arguments in evolutionary biology in the 60s and 70s. And so this is, to my way of thinking, caused people to reject cultural group selection out of hand without considering the evidence. And part of the reason is that nobody's ever considered the evidence all in one place. And so we decided to make a sketch of the evidence, because the argument here is that there's so much evidence that to really do it real justice, you'd have to write a multi-volume treatise, which I'm not up to, and my students weren't up to either. So that's the reason for that. Okay, so the starting point here is that human patterns of cooperation are unusual. We have lots of cooperation between distantly related and unrelated individuals. We have cooperation in many domains that is unusual. Most animals that cooperate, the social insects aside, cooperate over relatively few things. For example, chimpanzees, males cooperate to kill males in neighboring groups in order to take over their females. So, but they don't cooperate to raise young. They don't cooperate in foraging activities. They don't cooperate to extract resources that can only be extracted cooperatively. So their cooperation is limited, and so it goes in most other animals. So humans are unusual, and basically we cooperate in two different areas. This is Sergei Gavrilets, my senior author on this paper in PNAS, has analyzed in a couple of three papers two kinds of games. Games against them, which is contest with other groups, which I think us cultural evolutionists tend to overemphasize because of the altruism, the costly altruism that is exhibited in warfare and things like that. But games against them, goes to conflict and cooperation. Games against them are fitness reducing. You get two groups, and one group attacks the other group attacks back, and this is costly for both groups. And in general, the games against them reduce the fitness of the groups that participate. Games against nature, on the other hand, cooperating to say in hunting or or making a complex economy with a substantial division of labor. Games against nature are fitness enhancing in Sergei's analysis. So these are just two different, very general and large scale domains in which we cooperate. And we have the existence of corporate groups and social identity. So this is something that's characteristic of the social insects as well. They recognize fellow members of their group by colony recognition odors that are a little bit like ethnic markers or all the other kind of symbolic markers that we have of belonging to groups. The sociolinguists discovered in the 60s and 70s and 80s that microdialect variation springs up along any social fault line that comes to exist in human society. So this is a big difference between human groups and most other kinds of groups. Again, social insects accepted. And so there are a series of hypotheses to explain this unusual pattern of cooperation, and our paper in Behavior and Brain Science goes through these hypotheses. So the one that I'm going to defend here today is a cultural group selection and the accompanying culture-driven coevolution of an innate social psychology. So argument here is that culture is susceptible to group selection, and then human groups impose selection on genes that affect our social psychology. So some people say that humans domesticated themselves. That's a kind of a metaphor for this hypothesis, if you want. Now, the counter-argument, some people argue that, some evolutionary biologists particularly argue that culture is a proximate mechanism that can't influence genetic evolution. Maybe if you're familiar with this proximate ultimate distinction that Ernst Mayr made, arguing that selection on genes is the ultimate cause of everything, and proximate causes can't affect ultimate causes. It was his argument. Now, this is a big controversy if you follow evolutionary biology. There's a call amongst many evolutionary biologists for an extended evolutionary synthesis, because people argue that this claim is not true and that proximate mechanisms can affect evolution. And this cultural group selection argument and the culture-driven coevolution is a species of that kind. And the big argument is over how general this is. Are humans an exception in this or not? And again, many people argue that, take a hard line on this and say that culture really can't evolve. Only genes can really evolve in some sense. And then some people argue that kin selection and reciprocity suffice to produce indirect reciprocity. Namely, if somebody's nice to me and somebody else observes that, they'll be nice to me back, not the party that, in other words, third parties will observe the behavior of two cooperating individuals, and then if they cooperate, the third party may be inclined to cooperate with them in turn. So we can build up a big network of cooperation in which we don't repay each other directly, but indirectly through this network of cooperators. And then there's another argument made by mainly evolutionary psychologists that small-scale mechanisms misfire in large-scale society. So the idea is that kin selection and reciprocity were important in small-scale societies in the past. When we got these giant societies, people still treat each other as if they were close kin in small-scale societies. The psychological mechanisms misfire when we get to giant societies. And then there are people who think that rather than cultural group selection, that genetic group selection could be important in humans. E.O. Wilson is a prominent defender of this idea. So these are the suite of hypotheses, and I'm going to make a positive argument for that one. And if you have questions about our critique of these others, you can either read the paper or talk to me. So the big problem with genetic group selection is that a little bit of migration between groups is very damaging to variation between groups. It's hard to build up or maintain variation between groups in the face of migration between groups. And for this is the reason that theorists back in the 70s and 80s decided that genetic group selection was something that could only operate under highly specialized conditions, not including humans, because humans are fairly outbred. Groups in contact generally exchange mates, and so genetic variation is hard to maintain in groups that have a mating system like ours. So then how could cultural evolution be different? How could, we've made a series of arguments over the years, Rob Boyd and I, and lots of other people have contributed to this debate. And one thing is accurate, rapid social learning. So people have a big repertoire of culture. They learn it from their parents and other people in their social network, and they pretty faithfully replicate the culture of their society. Think of language. We maintain a language with vocabularies of tens of thousands of words and a bunch of fancy grammatical constructions, and every kid eventually learns to be pretty competent at the language that they learn as a kid. So this provides a kind of an inertial force. And then there's conformist social learning. So if you tend to imitate the majority, then that will discriminate against migrants from other groups. So migrants from other groups that are different will carry rare variants, and conformist transmission will tend to ignore rare variants, and so maintain variation between groups. There also may be lots of coordination payoffs. So even in systems of cooperation, there may also be coordination elements in it. So that'll tend to stabilize any practices in a culture, because you want to do things the same way everybody else does things, because there's a payoff to doing that. And then institutions are systems of punishment for deviance and rewards for conformity. So we have social rules, and you don't have to believe in the rules. In other words, you may, well, most of us here probably can think of a lot of rules of American culture, other cultures, that they'd just rather see abandoned. But it's pretty hard to, you can't abandon these social rules by yourself, because the systems of reward and punishment will obtain whether you agree with the rule or not. And so that will tend to homogenize behavior, even if there's quite a bit of underlying dissent about the institutions. Things like prestige bias can build up a substantial cultural difference in a big hurry. An extreme example would be Joseph Smith founding the Mormon church. So he had there's a great story about where all of his ideas came from, but he had a mishmash of ideas that ultimately came out of Europe, and including things from Freemasonry and hermeneutics and a bunch of other things. And he stirred them all together and distilled out the Mormon religion just all at once, and built a church around it, which is quite successful. Symbolic markers of group boundaries. So groups tend to be demarcated by symbolic differences. Dialect I've already mentioned, or language, dress, and other things. So it's easy to identify which groups you belong to, and people do that. And then institutional complexity will generate inertia that makes borrowing hard. So it's hard to observe in detail how an institution in a different society works. If you're not a participant, it's really hard to get all the nuances of another group's institutions. And then it's hard to try out institutions on a small scale. Technological things, steel axes, for example, anybody can try those out. But a social institution, you have to persuade a substantial number of people to adopt the new institution before it can be a going concern, right? So institutions are hard to borrow. So that tends to make societies retain differences, even when there's clearly a superior way of doing things out there. It still may be hard to adopt. The attempt after the fall of the Soviet Union for Russia to become some kind of modern Western capitalist democracy was a flop, right? Yeltsin couldn't make it go, and subsequently the Russians turned their back on that, and we have a new autocracy in Russia that resembles in lots of ways the classic autocracy that Russia's had since the czars. There are several forms of cultural group selection. Natural selection, differing groups compete, and winners destroy or absorb the losers. The Romans destroyed and absorbed the Celts, for example, in the building of the Roman Empire. Then there's selective imitation. Differing groups compete, and the losers borrow important elements from the culture of the winners. So a spectacular example of that is the Meiji Restoration, Japan, when the Japanese systematically went out and borrowed all sorts of Western technology and Western forms of social organization. So they thought the Germans had the best army and the British had the best navy. So they hired German army officers to train their army, and British naval officers to train their navy. And then there's selective immigration. People in poorly functioning groups seek to enter better functioning ones. So Hispanic migration into California in recent years would be an example of that sort of thing. And just a note here, I'm not specifying what groups I'm talking about here, because I think a large number of groups can, in principle, support cultural group selection. So, I mean, we have ethnic groups, we have businesses, we have universities, all sorts of organizations that compete with each other. Cities, states, churches, business enterprises, and any of these are candidates for being subject to this cultural group selection process. I have a little bit more to say about that. So I'm deliberately imagining here that when you cash out what group what is a group, that's an empirical question. And then another plank in this argument is that there is culture-driven gene culture coevolution. So the basic idea here is that we have social instincts, if you want, innate social capacities that are designed ultimately by selection and social selection for living in tribes. So humans are relatively docile. Humans are much more tolerant of strangers, say, than chimpanzees are. And then we identify with groups, and this cashes out as patriotism. We take the group's objectives to be our own. And empathy, so humans are relatively empathic. We understand the suffering of others, and often will go out of our way to ameliorate it. And then we have a relatively low frequency of psychopathy. So I think of dominance hierarchies as having 100% psychopaths. Each animal is out there to dominate the group if they can and take the rewards of kicking everybody else around. And this seems a little bit like human psychopathy to me. And something like 3% of males and 2% of females meet the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy. So somehow we've beaten down the psychopaths to a low roar. They cause plenty of trouble as it is, but we don't have frank dominance hierarchies most of the time. And the mechanisms are basically two kinds of mechanisms. One is natural selection on genes in cultural environments. So the most well worked out example of this is adult lactase secretion. Many of you may have heard this story. So cattle keeping people with a long history of cattle keeping have high rates of adult lactase secretion. Normally, the only lactose sugar you'll ever see is in your mother's milk. And so most mammals, I think all mammals known except some human groups, shut down lactase production, the enzyme that helps digest milk sugar, around the time of weaning. I mean, there's no sense producing this thing if there's nothing for it to do. It's just a waste of physiological energy. But in dairying populations in Western Europe and in Africa and in the Middle East, adult lactase secretion ranges from 50 to 100%. So we get more energy as adults out of milk than we would if we drank it without having the ability to break the 12-carbon sugar into two 6-carbon sugars that can be absorbed through the gut. So that's natural selection in a cultural environment. The dairying environment seems to have selected for this. And then there's social selection for norm following and other sorts of things. We imagine that the first step was simple culturally transmitted rules that were used to organize simple social systems. And then things like sexual selection would discriminate in favor of people who could follow norms. If you're a guy, you don't want to marry a woman who is just trouble, and the same thing for women. Women don't want to marry some guy who's just going to screw up all the time because people are mad at him for his misbehavior. So sexual selection might be an example of discrimination against troublemakers. But other forms of social selection might include a partner choice. So you're deciding which guy you're going to go hunting with, or if you're a woman, which gal you're going to go collecting with. And so you might tend to avoid psychopaths or people have other problems that might lead them to defect on cooperation. And then there's punishment. So if you punish people, it really handicaps their fitness, right? And then sexual, well, yeah. And then things like status enhancement and hiring and firing people are other examples. So what kind of evidence do we seek to test these hypotheses? So we want evidence that cultural variation is heritable, evidence that there's appreciable cultural variation between groups, evidence that such variation influences a competition between groups, and evidence that culture acts as a selective force on genes. So the first three of these things are just Darwin's basic syllogism about how natural selection works. And the fourth one there is relevant to this coevolution idea. Let's see. So evidence that culture acts as an inheritance system. There's a lot of developmental evidence that social learning in humans and is widespread in humans and other animals, but humans are faster and more accurate social learners than any other species. Hence, culture is much more important in our species than in other species. And even young children are sophisticated social learners. So, for example, they discriminate. Kids would prefer to imitate people that are like them. And it turns out that the strongest element in like them is speaking the same dialect or language. So kids will discriminate in favor of, in social learning, in favor of people who speak the same language or dialect. And kids readily learn norms. So people describe kids 4 or 5 years of age. If you ever had kids of that age, you know that they become little moral tyrants, right? And if you misbehave, if you do something that is normative, something they learn in school, for example, then they might try to shame you into behaving like they think you're supposed to. And then this leads to historical patterns of descent with modification. So another way of testing this idea is to look at culture history. And one way of doing that is to look at phylogeny. So this happens to be a phylogeny of the Tupi languages in the Amazon basin and neighboring areas. So this is a group that notionally can be traced back about 3,000 years. And so they speak a related series of languages, but they also have a bunch of other cultural features that are conservative. This is a group that practices what's called partible paternity. Is it? People heard of this? So partible paternity is the belief that kids have multiple fathers or can have multiple fathers. So if a woman is around the time of conception happens to be having sexual intercourse with 2 different guys, maybe mostly with her husband and some with another guy she likes, then the other guy that she likes is a secondary father, and in proportion to the amount of dalliance that he has with the woman, he's maybe a 25% father, and the other guy's a 75% father. And if there's a third guy involved, there could be, and there's an idea that multiple fathers are good. It's good for kids to have multiple fathers. And this partible paternity is ancestral in this group and has only been lost, I think, in 1 or 2 of these groups. So it's a very conservative cultural features. Other cultural features evolve much more quickly, but still they evolve. And the evidence that there's appreciable cultural variation between groups is, one of my former students, Adrian Bell, has worked on this problem. And this is from a paper that we published in 2009. And the black bars here are genetic FST. So FST is a population geneticist measure of the proportion of the total genetic variation at a locus, say, or across a bunch of loci that is between groups. And these are just neighboring groups. Adrian's reasoning was that it's only neighboring groups that can compete, right? So you can get FSTs way up here if you compare, say, people from Tierra del Fuego with people from Southern Africa, you can get pretty large FSTs, but those would never be competing groups. So neighboring groups, just as the theorists would have it, exchanging mates, the kind of human mating system that people have, won't allow very much genetic variation to build up. The gray bars are cultural FSTs that Adrian estimated. These are from Cavalli, Swartz, and Feldman, an old treatise on genetic variation. And these gray bars are from the World Values Survey. So these are opinion polls that have been conducted in many countries over a fairly long period of time. So you can get a massive amount of data, and you can see that the mean is much higher than it is in the genetic case. So this is the empirical leg of the argument that cultures actually do vary more than genes and can support cultural evolution. This is based on a Price's equation analysis, and it's in the paper. And so this is the amount of group benefit relative to individual costs that can be supported by variation in different kinds of political, religious, ethnic, and national provinces and nations. And so some of these groups vary very little, really, and so the group benefit has to be far larger than the individual cost. But out in this region, the benefits don't have to be all that much greater than the cost. So basically, from here to the right are cases of group variation that could support a respectable amount of cultural group selection. The ones to the left of that are ones that probably not going to be, probably wouldn't support much cultural group selection. So groups vary in how much variation there is between them, but some of them are quite high. And this doesn't include institutions. As I say, institutions are interesting because they suppress individual variation, and and essentially, if in the case of institutions, many neighboring societies might be further out on that curve, but.
What kind of groups are you considering here? So, tribes or?
Well, so this is a mixture of groups, religious groups. So. Let's see, there's a religious group, political groups, that's a political group, two political parties, for example, ethnic groups, different races or languages, and nations or provinces within nations. These two are national or provincial differences.
And this is in America?
No, this is all over the world. Yeah.
How are you measuring these things for benefit over individual costs?
I really don't have time to go into it, but if you look in the paper, the derivation of this is there. And so Price's equation looks at the variation within groups and the selection that's due to variation within groups, and the variation in the variation between groups and the component of selection that's related to that. So if there's a lot of variation between groups and not much individual variation within groups, then group selection can produce a large group benefit even at a fairly high individual cost.
So just to clarify, I think that's not empirical data, right? The FST is empirical data and the vertical axis is what you would need.
Yeah, there's a theoretically derived estimate of what amount of cultural group selection could be supported given the variation between groups and the variation within groups. So if all the variation is within groups, then the FST is low, and it's down in this region, and not much cultural group selection will be a weak force. That's the intuition. So and I've already mentioned that the evidence that children readily acquire norms from others. So I think in the interest of leaving time for questions, I've got to go faster here. So the evidence that institutions are group level traits. So institutions prescribe rules and assign roles. So marriage and kinship is a classic example. So you might think that marriage and kinship would be taken care of by kin selection and reciprocity. So, and yet all societies that we know of have some kind of institution that arranges for care of children. Sometimes marriages are very weak, but typically they're fairly strong. And the interesting thing is that in any given society there are one or maybe a few marriage contracts on offer, and people are sharply discouraged from deviating from those standard contracts, even though across all societies there's a myriad ways that marriage works. So, and they come with rewards for conformity and punishments. And why should, I mean, this is, you might think marriage is an agreement between a man and a woman, or maybe multiple men and multiple women in a few cases. So why not just leave it up to them? But societies supply a marriage contract and undertake to enforce it. And the idea is that strong marriages make strong societies. So there's a benefit to the whole group to having a well-organized system for taking care of children, basically. And I've already said institutions apply whether you believe in them or not. Institutions vary greatly from one society to another, and institutional differences are consequential. So pro-social societies tend to be rich and anti-social societies tend to be poor. And there's a beautiful set of data that came out of work that Benedict Herrmann did with Simone Gechter a few years ago. So this is the public goods game. Most people here know what the public goods game is. This is a public goods game played for 10 rounds in a bunch of different cities around the world. So much of the behavioral economics around the public goods game has been done in Western societies like Boston or Copenhagen. And here the cooperation starts out high and remains high. This is cooperation in a public goods game with punishment. But there's a huge range of societies, and many societies can't get cooperation organized at all. And some are kind of intermediate, and some are really interesting, like China. Well, this is a particular city in China, and the Chinese start out low, but by the end they're up there with the Westerners. So it's a different pattern, but the Chinese are also famous for their ability to organize on the fly. That's an interesting case. And the reason that many societies can't get cooperation going is because there are high rates of antisocial punishment. That is to say, cooperators are punished as well as people who defect in the public goods game. So here in Muscat, the amount of antisocial punishment is about the same as the amount of prosocial punishment, and Muscat is that one. So they just really can't get cooperation organized. This is closely related to trust in societies and statistically. And if you look at these societies, the ones down here are by and large poor, and the ones up there are by and large richer. In the case of China, getting richer at a phenomenal rate. This is consequential intergroup variation and presumably reflects social institutions. And so there's evidence that social groups compete. We go through warfare, economic organizations and religious organizations. Warfare is kind of obvious. Economic organizations, I mean, economists, particularly a few decades back, were interested in antitrust regulation, so that to essentially set up a system where businesses had to compete with one another. So they were basically making, by policy, making businesses compete with one another in order for selection to select the most efficient businesses and let the least efficient ones go by the wayside. and the kind of crony capitalism that's grown up since is relaxed antitrust regulations, and the surviving businesses make a lot more profit, but presumably there's a lot less consumer surplus. And then religious organizations compete for members, right? So at least in societies like the United States, where we don't have a state religion. There's evidence for group level functionality. So languages are an example. So there's the phenomenon of linguistic altruism that linguists talk a lot about. In other words, if you didn't think I had something useful to say to you, if I was just up here spouting a bunch of stuff that was designed to enhance my reputation or whatever, then you just wouldn't listen to me, right? You'd get up and walk out the door if you didn't think I had something potentially useful for you. And then dialect, I've already mentioned, dialect, language, jargon underpin social identities. So language has these two features. And basically the people you don't cooperate with, or you can't understand their language, right? So people that are really different speak a different language, and they might be people who are more, because they don't belong to your group, they might be more inclined to exploit you than people from within your group. Crime, deviance, punishment, domestic tranquility is a major public good. Migration in response to domestic disorder, I've already talked about. Impacts of punishment on genetic fitness. So Polly Wiesner told me a story about what happens to murderers in the Kungsan. She said they aren't punished, and she said what happens is that they're just exiled from the camp, and they have to go out and live in a satellite camp with their family. And if the family can't control their behavior, then they're liable to be assassinated. But that doesn't happen very often. She said that's not punishment. But she did say that what their draw on the pool of marriageable women is really poor. At best, they can marry an old woman. So that's sort of from a biologist's point of view, that's the ultimate punishment, right? Handicap your genetic fitness. That's the kind of thing that would get rid of psychopaths if there is a genetic component to psychopathy. And then religion and ritual. There are group-defining symbols that set up define what the group is. Moral codes and morality enforcers in lots of religions, and religious rituals reinforce group solidarity. So religions it can be argued look like adaptive organizations. So the conclusion that we have in this paper is that there's plenty of evidence that culture is a system of heritable variation. There's plenty of evidence that considerable cultural variation, there is evidence of plenty of cultural variation at the level of groups, especially institutional differences. And there's plenty of evidence that cultural variation often determines the outcome of intergroup competition. We provide some examples. So, and then there's good evidence, we think, that not so great evidence because, well, I could go into that, the complexity of the genetic system. Good evidence that culture can drive social selection on genetic variation. So, thank you for your ears, and thanks to my co-authors and to Rob Boyd for our long collaboration, and to reviewers and commentators. Thanks.